welcome to TrustTalk. In today's episode, we travel to one of the hardest places on Earth to study trust. Cities shattered by war and ruled, at times, by armed groups rather than states. Our guest, Mara Revkin, is a leading scholar of governance and justice in conflict zones. Someone who has spent years listening to civilians forced to make impossible choices about whom to trust when every option is dangerous. Her research shows that trust isn't about ideology, it's about survival. People stay, flee, comply, or resist based on two core pillars: predictability and procedural fairness. Even in the harshest settings, civilians look for the actor whose rules are consistent, whose justice feels less corrupt, and whose behavior they can anticipate. But those pillars sit within a broader ecosystem: the quality of basic services, perceived motives of combatants, communication during military operations, and the remedies offered after harm. Mara explains why groups like ISIS sometimes win compliance not by winning hearts, but by appearing more reliable than the alternatives, and why trust can erode just as quickly when predictability collapses. She also reveals what international actors often get wrong about transitional justice, and what actually helps communities rebuild legitimacy and trust after conflict. Your host, Severin de Wit.
Mara, welcome to TrustTalk. It's a pleasure to have you with us because your work on governance, justice and civilian life in conflict zones has shaped much of what we know about trust under the most difficult conditions. I'm very grateful you could join me to discuss your research and its implications. So let's start.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm a fan of the podcast and really look forward to the conversation.
Let's kick off with my question about your article in the Journal of Conflict Resolution, where you examine why some civilians stayed under ISIS rule while others fled. When the state collapses and a rebel group becomes the de facto authority, what are the key factors that shape whether civilians trust that authority enough to remain or don't?
So in Mosul, the survey and interviews showed that many civilians had a favorable view of the quality of ISIS governance in comparison with the Iraqi state in terms of its perceived corruption, the effectiveness of basic services like cleaning of streets, electricity, and regulation of food prices, at least for the first few months of ISIS rule. And that was in some cases an important reason for staying, or at least a willingness to give ISIS a chance to govern.
You write about what you call competitive governance, situations where armed groups and states both try to provide services. How do civilians evaluate which actor is more trustworthy when both sides claim to offer security, justice, or services?
So it may definitely be the case, particularly in authoritarian and conflict-affected societies, that neither the government nor the rebel group is perfectly trustworthy, and civilians then are making hard choices in terms of which is less bad or which is going to be perceived as perhaps more reliable, even if they're not necessarily trustworthy or legitimate in an absolute sense. So I would say it's always important to keep in mind the relativity of these comparisons. One thing that was very important for ISIS was a perceived predictability and neutrality of its justice system, which, although harsh, was considered less susceptible to corruption and bribery than either the Iraqi or Syrian justice systems had been previously.
Many rebel groups try to build trust through courts, taxation systems, or even dispute resolution mechanisms. What does your research reveal about how armed groups attempt to manufacture trust and legitimacy? Is it real or from the perspective of civilians?
Yeah, so starting from the side of rebel groups, they're interested in building trust and legitimacy for the same instrumental reasons that any state would. So they want to encourage compliance with the decisions and authority, and they also want to make it easier for them to extract resources from the population, whether that's taxes or military conscription, and they want to decrease the likelihood of resistance or rebellion. So it makes sense that ISIS and so many other rebel groups have established courts at a very early stage engage in their state-building processes before implementing taxes or some of these more extractive policies. In terms of how those legal institutions are perceived from the civilian side, it's a question of relativity and comparison between multiple options, many of which are bad to different extents. So in the case of ISIS, there was evidence from Syrians and Iraqis I've interviewed and surveyed that courts were faster, less susceptible to corruption, and more efficient than the Iraqi and Syrian government alternatives. And that definitely made a difference, at least in compliance or willingness to tolerate conditions in ISIS-controlled areas. I wouldn't say necessarily that it was an indicator of true legitimacy or trust, but at least a willingness to comply or a preference for remaining in ISIS-controlled areas rather than leaving for areas still controlled by the Iraqi or Syrian governments.
In your study on displacement decisions, you show that governance quality, not only coercion, shapes whether people stay. How do civilians weigh trust in governance against fear of violence when making life or death choices in conflict zones?
Great question. And this is one I asked explicitly in a couple of ways on the survey in Mosul about the perceived risk of remaining in Mosul under ISIS control as compared with the risk of fleeing the city to areas under the Iraqi government's control. And over time, that calculation was initially it weighed in ISIS's favor. Staying was perceived as sort of the safest default option. Initially, there was a kind of honeymoon period where ISIS was providing services reasonably effectively, subsidized bread and other things sort of intended to build goodwill with the population. But over time, as ISIS's own governance became increasingly authoritarian and repressive, civilians began to weigh the risk of staying differently. And the balance for many weighed more heavily in favor of leaving. The risks calculation was very much affected by the onset of bombing and the air war operations against the Islamic State. So yes, over time, certainly a number of risks of staying in ISIS territory. And over time, those came to exceed the risks of leaving for many. Although by that point, ISIS had imposed really strict controls on travel and essentially a travel ban that made it impossible for anyone to leave.
Civilians often appear to navigate conflict by engaging in a kind of pragmatic trust. In your fieldwork, have you encountered examples where people trust an armed group not because they support it, but because they believe it will keep its promises for better or worse?
Yes, definitely in the context of ISIS, we see this. In many cases, my interviewees acknowledged that they personally disagreed with ISIS's ideology, disagreed with many of its policies and rules, but nonetheless, they were reassured that ISIS was more likely to follow its own rules and more predictable than either the Syrian or Iraqi governments had been. Despite the rules being normatively objectionable, people were fairly confident that if they learned the rules and complied with them, they would personally be able to remain safe. And at least in the short term, that was confirmed by many people's experiences, at least for the first year or so of ISIS rule. Just an important point I want to make is that their legality or their own compliance, ISIS's own compliance and legality over time deteriorated significantly to a point where by the end, they were really perceived as more corrupt than the Syrian and Iraqi governments.
Like you just said, people judge armed groups by their motives as much as by their actions. So how does the intent people perceive, good or bad, shape whether they trust the army or a non-state group using violence around them?
So in the study of alien perceptions of military operations in Mosul, we found that civilians were very sensitive to what they perceived the motivations to be, both of individual soldiers and then the motive or objective of the battle plan overall. And there was a major change in strategy between the operations in East Mosul and West Mosul, where the coalition explicitly shifted from a strategy of attrition to one of complete annihilation of ISIS at all costs to the civilian population and infrastructure. So we were able to study, almost like a natural experiment, the effects of these very different modes of warfighting on civilian perceptions. And we found that indeed in East Mosul, where the fighting had been much more protective of civilians at a higher risk to those combatants, we see higher levels of perceived legitimacy of combatants as compared to West Mosul, where there was much more indiscriminate bombing and higher levels of casualties. Iraqi forces there, as well as the international forces who supported them, are perceived as far less legitimate.
Some of your findings suggest that legitimacy can be eroded even when harm is accidental, but poorly communicated. How important is communication, explanations, apologies, transparency for maintaining trust in the midst of a conflict?
So transparency and communication are extremely important, both for militaries to provide civilians with information they need to remain safe. So instructions about upcoming operations so they can make decisions whether to flee or not. A problem during the battle for Mosul is that there were perceived to at least be unclear or conflicting information at times from the coalition as to whether or not civilians were being instructed to remain in place to shelter in their homes versus flee. That's very, very crucial that communications like that be made clearly. In terms of the reasons for harm, this gets to your last question about the perceived legitimacy of a military operation. There is a widespread recognition among civilians that some amount of collateral damage is necessary and unavoidable. But the problems come about when civilians perceive the amount of damage as being disproportionate to the military objective being pursued, consistent with principles of proportionality and laws of war. And also when they perceive military forces as having been careless or perhaps negligent in causing harm. So in these kinds of contexts where there have been violations of laws of war or unreasonable or excessive amounts of civilian harm, studies in other contexts show that reparative gestures like apologies and even more so material compensation like reparations can make a difference in rebuilding trust or at least acceptance of what's happened. That's also something that I'm in the process of studying with a more recent survey in Mosul conducted last year, and still analysis is still in progress for that. But one finding that stands out so far is that while apologies can be helpful, in contexts where there's been enormous destruction like Mosul, people care much more about the amount of compensation.
If international actors push their own version of justice and it doesn't fit with local expectations, how does that affect the community's ability to rebuild trust?
So one of the most consistent findings of the empirical literature on community perceptions of transitional justice measures is that they can have unintended negative consequences if they are not designed in ways that reflect local preferences, particularities of the local context. This means that when international consultants and donors, programming implementers come in and implement something that may have been perceived as working well in Ireland or South Africa, it will not necessarily work in Iraq. And this is a problem I've tried to address in the research agenda with Rachel Myrick and Al Rababa, looking at evidence-based transitional justice. But there we see that it is important for communities to be perceived as having a voice in the design of transitional justice processes, consistent with actually some of Tom Tyler, one of your previous guests' work on procedural justice. In the design of any legal system or new process, civilians want to feel that their voices are heard and not simply that they're having a process imposed on them externally.
Your work shows how important it is to include public attitudes in transitional justice. Why do you think many of these initiatives have had such hard time gaining the trust of the communities they are meant to help?
The use of public opinion survey data to inform the design of transitional justice policies is actually a pretty recent development. Up until recently, the field was known for being very theory-driven without a lot of empirical evaluation of its actual effects of things like truth commissions or prosecutions on the intended beneficiaries of those policies. The move towards more surveys and actual evidence-based evaluation of transitional justice outcomes is relatively recent. It's an exciting field where scholars are also doing not just surveys, but what are known as field experiments on real-world interventions, like testing the effects of a museum on the attitudes of people who visit the museum. So there's a lot of, I think, work happening now to do a better job of incorporating public opinion into the design of transitional justice policies, but that's a very recent development in the field, probably only in the last 10 years.
From your surveys and fieldwork, what results about trust or legitimacy have really surprised you, but tend to be overlooked by policymakers?
So first finding we see across different contexts is that civilians don't necessarily equate the harshness of punishment with justice. There are other types of remedies or justice mechanisms that may be perceived as equally or more effective, depending on the context and depending on the nature of the offense. So in some cases, civilians are very supportive of more community-based reparations, things like community service or investments in schools, infrastructure development, and in some cases would prefer that those types of more community-based and restorative measures be prioritized over individual individual prosecutions of perpetrators. So I think that's an important corrective against the international criminal justice system's historical, I think, focus on individual accountability of perpetrators. And then another finding that comes out of the work I've done on competitive governance in authoritarian and conflict-affected settings is that procedural fairness and predictability are often much more important to people than what we think of as human rights or civil liberties. So in the context of wartime Syria, where civilians were needing to make choices between living in an area controlled by ISIS or areas controlled by a number of different rebel groups, many of which were perceived as even more lawless or abusive of civilians, that's also an authoritarian context where no one's ever had the opportunity to vote in a free or fair election or had true freedom of speech. So I think sometimes it's surprising to people that civilians in these contexts may be expressing a genuine preference for a group like ISIS over an alternative like the Syrian government. But it's important to understand the baseline expectations of people living in authoritarian and conflict-affected settings, which are very, very different from the kind of social contract or expectations that citizens of a democracy may have.
Reintegrating former fighters or collaborators is one of the greatest trust challenges after war. From your work in Iraq and other contexts, what helps communities begin to trust individuals who were once seen as part of the enemy?
So we have found that some types of programming and interventions can increase the likelihood that former collaborators or even combatants might be reintegrated into society, including things like rehabilitation programs, community service, apologies, payments of compensation. We found in Mosul that when respondents who otherwise oppose the reintegration of former collaborators are encouraged to change their minds and allow reintegration by a tribal or religious authority, a significant percentage, 15% of them, are persuaded to change their minds and allow reintegration. So we do find some evidence that people can change their minds, and there are some incentives that can facilitate that. But on the other hand, it's also important to keep in mind that there are some hard limits to forgiveness and reintegration, particularly in contexts of severe atrocities where civilians may genuinely feel that they've experienced crimes that can never be forgiven under any circumstances. And then in those contexts, the timeline for eventual reintegration and peace building may be longer. So in northwestern Iraq, I would say that what's possible maybe 3 or 4 generations from now is different from what is possible in the immediate aftermath of severe atrocities. So important to also keep in mind the time span of interventions.
Yeah. In conflict zones, people may fear that speaking openly is dangerous. How do you navigate the trust dynamics between researcher and respondent, and what responsibilities does that create?
I have never conducted surveys in anywhere that is currently controlled by either a rebel group or an authoritarian regime. That would not be safe or ethical for a variety of reasons and would also yield biased results because of preference falsification and the reasons you mentioned of people not feeling comfortable speaking openly under conditions of repression. So the survey I conducted in Mosul was in 2018, several months after the city had been recaptured from ISIS by Iraqi forces. And we did initially have a lot of concerns about the ethics and appropriateness of asking questions in a context like that. So as with all of my quantitative surveys, I did a lot of initial piloting, doing qualitative interviews with residents of Mosul to ensure first that we were even asking questions that were appropriate and relevant, that respondents were sufficiently comfortable answering questions. And we found through those interviews that there actually was at the time a high level of interest in taking the survey because it was one of the first research surveys in Mosul since the battle. And a lot of people, I think, perceived it as an opportunity to share experiences they've had that they felt very strongly about and wanted to bring to a wider audience. So the last point I'll make about that is on the survey, we do collect a response rate. So we calculate the percentage of the random sample of respondents when you go door to door conducting a survey, how many people refused to take the survey. And we had a response rate of 87%. So only 13% refused. And I think that also reflects the fact that the questions were considered not particularly sensitive at the time because we were asking about issues that people had been living with and dealing with for the past several years.
My last questions are about broader lessons for policy, peace building and the future. So, across your research, what is the biggest misconception external actors like governments, NGOs, UN agencies have about trust in conflict zones?
So I would say three things about misconceptions in the field. One is that trust is based on ideological alignment. In reality, we find that trust is much more dependent on predictability, components of procedural justice, ability to provide security in wartime contexts. The same types of procedural justice elements that have been studied by Tom Tyler and others are often more important than ideological agreement. And we also find that harsh punishment is not necessarily preferred, which is at odds with the way that international criminal law is designed, with a focus on accountability for perpetrators. In many cases, trust is more likely to be rebuilt through remedial measures like compensation and apologies that focus on addressing moral injuries that civilians have experienced. And importantly, distrust in the present is not only shaped by experiences with the current government, but also by historical legacies of distrust and grievances with previous governments.
If international actors want to build trust rather than undermine it, maybe follow up on what you just said, what are the top 3 principles they must follow?
So I think one is a role for public opinion, or at least consulting with affected communities about what they've experienced and what remedies or interventions they would most prefer as a first step. Public opinion can't be the sole determinant of policy, but it's an important ingredient. And I think it's equally important to be investing in anti-corruption and procedural justice safeguards. So in any context where we're designing justice institutions, talking about trials or prosecutions, it's extremely important that any new justice processes be conducted with the kinds of procedural fairness that we found are very important to people over and over in different contexts.
My last question, from your perspective, what should listeners keep in mind about trust in places where the state has failed? What do people often get wrong? And what gives you hope?
So one thing that gives me a lot of hope is that trust and social cohesion are never completely destroyed during war. That's a common misperception, is that war can completely destroy the social contract and everything then needs to be rebuilt from scratch. Instead, I think we see civilians still finding ways to maintain social cohesion and at least interpersonal horizontal trust and solidarity in the way that we think about a horizontal social contract during situations of war and authoritarian repression. And part of rebuilding is about how to leverage the resilience and persistence of social cohesion that managed to remain during a war. In most contexts, we are never really starting from scratch. And it's important very much to take into consideration both people's experiences and the grievances they experience during conflict, but also leverage resilience and some of the persistent social cohesion that managed to survive during war.
Mara, thank you for your interesting insights and your wonderful research in this unusual subject, I would say. Thank you for enlightening us. I wish you good luck with your further investment and research into this wonderful subject.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you. Thanks again.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.